When setting up the timer assembly, we have two basic settings. The first setting will be setting up the gallonage wheel, and that'll be done right up in here, and it's very similar to our 5600 control valve. Setting the gallonage on the outside perimeter, opposite the white dot, and we'll set the gallons that you have between regenerations. Removing the cable in the back of the meter assembly and then swinging out the timer will expose the program wheel for regeneration purposes. The regeneration will be done with a series of pins, holes, and then some stop pins. But before we start setting up anything on the timer assembly, we first have to understand what happens with the resin that we're regenerating. The recovery on resin is very similar to a pump curve. As you go higher and higher in head height, you get to a point where the pump can't pump any more gallonage. You peak out the pump. The same thing holds true with resin. Let's take an example of 1 cubic foot of resin. The maximum capacity of 1 cubic foot of resin is way out here on the curve. That 1 cubic foot of resin will have a 30,000 grain capacity. That's all based on salting it at 15 pounds of salt. Now let's say we cut that salt in half. Let's go 8 to 9 pounds of salt. We come back here on the curve and come across, and you'll notice that the capacity has not been cut in half. But what we're really at is about 24,000 grains capacity. If we cut the salt back even further, let's say to about 6 pounds on this cubic foot, again coming back up on the curve and over, we're at approximately 20,000 grains capacity. Knowing what you have in resin volume and what you're salting it at is a key thing in setting up the equipment for the gallonage. Let's take an example. Example are twin 1 cubic foot units. We're going to be using 9-inch diameter tanks. We're going to test the water out and compensate for iron and everything else, and we're going to have 24 grain water we're going to be working with. The units will be salted at 9 pounds of salt. That 9 pounds of salt, again, will give us 24,000 grains of usable capacity. And this is a key thing. We're not setting up the equipment for 30,000, but for what the salt setting is for that particular piece. Now, with 24,000 grain capacity, to figure out the gallons of water you have from cycle to cycle, the gallons of water available is taking the capacity of the unit, 24,000 grains, and dividing it by our hardness of 24 grains hard. 24 into 24,000 will give us 1,000 gallons available from cycle to cycle. Now, like I mentioned before in the beginning of this segment, all of our regeneration, backwash, brining, slow rinse, rapid rinse, and brine tank refill are done with conditioned or softened water. The only reserve we have to build in is the water we're taking away for the regeneration cycles. So we have to take a look then at the reserve capacity that's going to be needed to regenerate this 1 cubic foot system. We have to take a look at the various cycles when determining the reserve, the flow rates, and the times that we have set for that particular regeneration cycle. Let's go to the first cycle, our backwash. Let's say we typically have an 8-minute backwash time. That 9-inch diameter tank will be backwashed at 2 gallons a minute. That'll give us then, used out of that system, the other system, 16 gallons of water used. The next cycle in operation is the brining and slow rinse. Typically for that size piece of equipment, 50 minutes should be adequate for the brining and slow rinse cycle. Using a number 1 injector, the flow rate at the drain for that 50-minute time period will be 1/3 of a gallon a minute. 50 minutes times 1/3 of a gallon a minute, and you're going to be running another 16 gallon and a half out to drain, but using it from the capacity of the other system. The next cycle of operation is the rapid rinse cycle. Typical setting for that will be a 6-minute setting, and we're flowing at the same rate as we did in the backwash cycle, 2 gallons a minute. So 6 minutes times the 2 gallons a minute will give us 12 gallons used. Now we're also refilling the brine tank with conditioned water. Even though it's a nominal amount, we should take this into account, especially if you're working on larger systems. 9 pounds of salt will equate to approximately 3 gallons of water. Now we want to take all of these different gallon flows for each one of the regeneration cycles, total them up. What we have here is 16, 32.5, 44.5, 47.5 gallons used from the other tank for regeneration. We're starting out, remember, with 1,000 gallons of water. That's what's available from the system. We want to subtract that 47.5 gallons. And basically what we want to set the equipment up for is 950 gallons. I know the mathematics doesn't work out exactly, but the meter gallon wheel on the front of the timer is calibrated, and that's about as close as we can get. Once we've set up the meter program wheel on the front of the timer, as I swung the timer open, I said we can now set the times of regeneration, and there was that program wheel in the back that we were looking at. It had a series of pins, a number of holes, and pins and holes again. This is just an enlarged view of that meter program wheel, or the regeneration program wheel. And you'll notice when we come back to that timer, there's a notch in that wheel, and there's a little switch, and we call this the homing switch. When the program wheel is back in that position, there should be no water running at the drain. The unit should be back into the service position. When you start from that 0 point, and you'll see a series of pins. Those initial first pins that you see will be our backwash time. If you need longer backwash time, we have additional pins at the bottom of the timer that you can pull out and add to, adding them right next to the last pin on that part of the program. The micro switch will follow along the pins, then it'll drop off into a long series of holes. This series of holes right here is our brining and slow rinse cycle. This is the time needed to draw that brine solution in and then slowly rinse it out. As we advance a little bit farther, you'll see another second set of pins on the meter program wheel. The second set of pins will be our rapid rinse cycle. Rapid rinse is like a downflow purge. We're pushing the water through the resin. We're getting rid of any salt that may be left, any color throw that may be left if you're in iron-type water. Again, each one of the pins represents a time sequence. The pins have to follow one right after another. You cannot have a gap in that pin sequence. If you're on clean water, you might want to shorten this cycle. If you're on dirty water, you might want to lengthen that cycle. The most critical setting is this next section right here. We have a series of holes, and then we have 2 pins at the end. These 2 pins at the end are the stop pins. The holes that we have in between this series of pins and the 2 stop pins is our brine tank refill. When I say this is the most critical, this is going to determine the amount of capacity we have out of that unit each regeneration. When we're setting this up, we have to take a look at the back of the unit and you'll find a label. The label will either be blue, black, or red. The blue represents a 1/4 gallon a minute flow. The black represents a 1/2 gallon a minute flow, and the red represents 1.0 gallons per minute flow. When we're determining what time we want for that particular salt setting, let's go back to our example again. We want a 9-pound salt setting. And when we're looking at that 9 pounds of salt, we have to take into account 1 gallon of fresh water will dissolve approximately 3 pounds of salt. Now, we want a 9-pound salt setting. That means we're going 3 times up on the salt. We have to go 3 times then up on the gallons that we're putting back into the brine tank. So here we'd have to put 3 gallons of water back in. That'll give us a 9-pound salt setting for that regeneration. Now that label I was talking to you about in the back that is either blue, black, or red is called the BLFC, brine line flow control flow rate. Now if it's a black label on the back, that represents 0.5 gallons per minute going back into the brine tank. You'll also see another piece of information on there that'll represent the pounds of salt being dissolved at that rate. It'll be 1.5 pounds per minute. Using either piece of information, you're going to come up with the same time setting. Let's take a look at the first piece, the 1/2 gallon a minute flow. Now we need 3 gallons of water to go back into the brine tank. If we're flowing at a 1/2 gallon a minute, that means for 2 minutes, we've got 1 gallon of water. 4 minutes, we have 2 gallons. 6 minutes, we have then 3 gallons, and that's what we want to set it up on. You can go that way, or you can take this 1.5 pounds per minute piece of information, and for each minute, it's 1.5 pounds of salt. For 2 minutes, it's 3. 4 minutes, it's 6. And 6 minutes, it would be again 9 pounds of salt. The gap that you have in here represents that time sequence we just figured out. We do need, at the end of that time sequence, these 2 stop pins. If we don't have those stop pins in, the unit will keep refilling the brine tank until we get back into this home position. We'll overflow the brine tank. If you happen to have a safety brine valve in there, it'll shut off. You'll be using a lot more salt than you had predetermined for that size piece of equipment. But always keep those last 2 stop pins in, keeping that gap in there to whatever you're figuring out for your capacity and for your salt setting. Now let's go back to the unit. We'll go back to the front of the timer, our meter program wheel right here. Remember I said that we wanted that white dot that is right down there to be right next to the gallons we want to set on the unit. By pulling out this inner dial, we disengaged little parts in the on the meter program wheel so that we can make that setting. We wanted 950. Right here you can see we're putting it between the 9 and 10. The numbers on this meter program wheel go from 1 through 21 times 100. 9 times 100 would be 900 gallons. 10 times 100 would be 1,000 gallons. We're putting that white dot in between the 9 and the 10. Take the manual regeneration knob, make one turn, one complete turn around, and make sure that the white dot comes back right opposite this little arrow. This is our service position or our start position. Now we've set up the unit so that as we use water, the mechanical meter cable will turn. It'll register down until we hit our 0 point. When we hit this point, we'll start the timer up and take a look right here at the meter program wheel. Once we start the regeneration, it snaps itself back right to that start point again, so we're counting gallonage almost immediately. Now let's swing the timer open. Again, making sure that you've disconnected the meter cable from the meter. If you don't, you'll pull the meter cable assembly out of the timer. You could also pull the clutch assembly out. When we get back to this meter program, or the program wheel for regeneration times, you'll find two tabs right in the center. You have to push those two tabs together and hold them as you pull out on the wheel. As you pull out, you'll have to push up on the micro switch here and then take your wheel assembly out. Starting at 0, we have a series of pins. And this meter program wheel, I'll just rotate this around, you'll notice that each pin or hole is represented by 1 minute. We have other timers available for larger systems, and each pin or hole represents 2 minutes. The timer motor is directly related to the meter program, or the program regeneration wheel. But on this one here, in our example, first series of pins is our backwash time. Then we hit our gap right in here, right along in here, and that's our brining and slow rinse time. Our second set of pins is our rapid rinse or our purge time. The gap that we have right in here is our brine tank refill, and that's at 6 minutes that we had figured out for that 9-pound salt setting. And then our 2 stop pins right here. For if any reason you wanted to lengthen this time right here for backwash, I mentioned to you at the bottom of the timer there's about 13 additional pins that you can pull out. They're like roll pins. You pull them out and just press them in right next to the next pin. If you wanted to lengthen the brining and slow rinse time, you shift these other pins towards the end of the cycle further over towards the end to create a larger gap and a longer time for brining and slow rinse. The same thing holds true as in backwash for our rapid rinse pins. Adding or subtracting will increase or decrease the rapid rinse cycle. And if we wanted to salt more, to get a higher capacity, or if the unit was much larger than the 1 cubic foot example we went through, take those last 2 stop pins and shift them farther over, creating a larger gap. Once you've made these settings, you take the regeneration program wheel and reinsert it back into the timer assembly. Noting that you have a hole here, which is a location hole that'll reorientate this regeneration program wheel in a proper position. Just turn this around here. This hole here lines up with that little tit that sticks out. Whoops, there we go. And then once you get it started, you'll have to lift up on the inner micro switch and snap that program wheel back into place. Now you take the timer, insert it back into the back plate, snap it into place. Take our meter cable, insert it back into the meter, and now we're all set. We've programmed the gallonage for the amount of resin and the salting that we have, and we also have programmed the regeneration cycles for the water condition.